just waiting for a few people to join us. We will start within 1 or 2 minutes, I promise you. Just bear with us, please.
Okay.
Whilst you are waiting, feel free to use the chat facility. It's always nice to know who's online, and in particular, maybe tell us the location you're joining us from. It's always interesting to know how far these things reach. Welcome. For those of you that have just joined, we'll just give another minute for those latecomers, and we will start at 2 minutes past, I promise you. As I've said before, feel free to use the chat facility to introduce yourselves and maybe share with us where you are joining from. There are people that are around the globe this morning, so it'd be nice to know how far we're reaching. Okay, well, it's 2 minutes past 11, so I'll make a start now. Obviously, people will be joining us as we progress. But look, I'd just like to say a very good morning to you. Welcome to this morning's webinar. I'm Brendan Morahan. I'm co-founder and director of Invent. We've got businesses in London, Dublin, and Toronto, and we travel around the globe with our customers where they need our support as appropriate. I have mentioned already that there is that chat facility. Please do feel free to introduce yourselves, and particularly it's always interesting to find out the locations you're joining us from. You'll all be very aware of this format now, so please use the chat to add comment during the course of this morning, and also to raise any questions that you want us to pick up in the Q&A session. The event itself will be recorded, and a link to that recording to our YouTube channel will be sent to everyone who's registered as an email after the event, so hopefully you'll be able to refer to that in future. This morning I'm delighted to be joined by a number of people on our panel. Firstly, we've got Robin Partington, founding director and owner of joint owner of Apt Architects. Good morning, Robin.
A very good morning.
I'm also joined, I'll ask you to introduce yourselves in a minute. I'm also joined by a colleague of mine, Sarah Moati.
Good morning.
And we were due to be joined by Alison Ring, but unfortunately she's unwell this morning, so I'm sure you'll join me in wishing her a speedy recovery. And in her place, I'm delighted that we've got Hedley Smythe, Emeritus Professor from Bartlett School at UCL, joined us. So thank you very much for joining at short notice. I'm sure you'll contribute ably. So what I'd like to do is maybe ask each of the panel to introduce yourselves a bit further and maybe give some initial brief thoughts on the effect recent events have had, and more importantly will have, on our sector moving forward. Maybe I could ask you to start, Robin.
Yes, thank you, and good morning from a slightly overcast Clerkenwell. I'm in the studio, which is an interesting and rather lonely existence at the moment, as most of our office are actually working from home, as I'm sure is the case for everybody else. For me, the environment that we're currently in, architects, I guess professional vagrants, we're very used to working in trains with a laptop or porter cabins on site or cafes tucked around the corner. So it wasn't too difficult for us to adapt quite quickly. But I do miss people. I miss the cut and thrust of the industry that we're all a part of. And so that's a downside to things, I guess. There is an upside, though, in that I think people are going through some terrible times, but I'm looking forward now, and the year ahead, I think is going to be one of the most exciting times for all of us to live through. Absolutely amazing pace of change across our entire industry, but we can talk about that a little later.
Exactly. Thank you. Sarah, maybe you can introduce yourself.
I'm an architect specializing in the future innovation of smart cities, urban science, and spatial data analysis. Currently, I'm pursuing a master's in smart cities and urban analytics at the Center for Advanced Spatial Analysis at the Bartlett, actually, in UCL. My current research interests are focused on the areas of data science and the urban informatics. So briefly, I'm in a continuous quest for ground that lies at the intersection of architecture, urban planning, and data science. Concerning the impact, I think the pandemic has uncovered some unsustainable aspects of the way in which our cities operate. This is like a macro level opinion. It raised questions about numerous uncertainties created by the situation. For example, implications of increased working from home, impact that this had on various service industries, locations in cities, what policies are needed to be developed, will be a rebalancing of population between cities and countryside, for example, what will happen in terms of rural infrastructure, and many others we will discuss later on.
Okay. Thanks, Sarah. And last but not least, Hedley.
Hi. I've been researching for many years now about the construction firm and teaching on that, and I've worked in construction as well. In essence, I think the business model is failing for the main contractors. The headline is, if they don't change, they will be superseded by disruptors. That's very clear when we look at profit levels in the Second World War, which were above 15%. In 1949, they were around 15%. And the industry was complaining in the UK that it had fallen to 4.3% by 1978. I think many main contractors would quite like the 4.3% margin these days. But the pressures, the downward pressures, particularly driven by bidding, conniving with, or rather government has connived with that, have brought the industry to a crisis. And we've already seen some failures. We're ahead of the curve compared to many other countries, but we're all on the same track, even the Chinese that are growing very quickly. And some real change is needed. I don't just mean the sort of incremental change that we've come to see as commonplace, but more transformatory change. And there've been a number of calls for that, and there've been some efforts to undertake that, but it hasn't really materialized yet. Essentially, we have to move from a model of return on capital employed to return on investment. And that's going to take quite a long time to change, but it needs to occur. And when we look down at the more micro level, what does that mean for certain types of functions like health and safety? It essentially means moving from a position of compliance to one of care. And so that we change the way that we treat our staff and our members in the supply chain who operate on site. And that's a real challenge, because that itself, making that change, challenges the business model too, because it means that intensive and extensive working are not quite so possible. Driving people to act and behave in unsafe ways is a real challenge to the whole subcontracting system. So
let's
just
pick up
these
on
small
that
changes are quite fundamental.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. Okay, well, thank you for that. Just before we broaden out the discussion, obviously a number of people have joined us since this introduction, so you're all very welcome. Please do use the chat facility to introduce yourself, including the location you're calling in from. Please. And also please use it for any questions that you want to be picked up in the Q&A session later. But I repeat, you're all very welcome. The other point, I've just had a request that maybe, it's lovely seeing you all, but if you're inclined to turn your cameras off, it will help the bandwidth so that we can all focus on the panel themselves. So thank you for that. I trust that isn't too rude a request. But taking Hedley's point, Robin, we're talking about health and safety. Clearly that's up and foremost in everyone's mind now when we start to come out of lockdown. What do you believe, and what's your understanding of what individuals will be looking for in the workplace as they start to come out of lockdown? And how enabled are we to facilitate that?
It's difficult to separate the workplace from getting people to the workplace. And I think the one thing that underlines all of that is trust. People need to have trust and faith in public transport, in the way that they get to and from work, and in the place of work. And I don't think it's necessarily any one thing that you can do to create that sense of trust. There's no magic bullet. There's going to be so many different facets that we will all need to address, depending on the building type, the location. You'll have regional needs, you'll have local needs, and you'll have business specific needs to address. And I guess you can split it into two parts. You can do things which are incredibly good at improving the health of the environment that we're working in, that we're traveling in terms of points of compression. So, for example, when you get in a taxi or a bus, you're in a point of compression. Same on a train. You need to make those feel safe, and there are things that you can do to make them safe, but nobody's aware of. In an office building, you could put an ultraviolet battery in the air handling duct to kill bugs in the fresh air system, but you would never see it. You'd never know it was there. The building's looking after you, but it's not sending out or signaling that message particularly well. There are things that you can do which are more overt and more obvious that will help people to feel safe and more comfortable. Even I've spoken about it before, but the Victorians were very good at this. They if you go around lots of hospitals and schools in the Victorian era, all the door handles and push plates on doors were made out of brass. One of the things that an office building could do very simply is to take off all that stainless steel and put brass there. Why? Because the copper in brass is a natural bactericide. It kills bugs. And so that's a very visual, very tangible thing you could do to transform a building that says this building is beginning to look after you. And the host organization, your company, your business is a part of that. So I don't think there's any one thing, one magic bullet or message that I can give out. It's going to be across the board, a whole range of things that we're going to have to change, not just to buildings, the configuration of buildings, what happens at the base, the middle and the top, but to public transports. I think our streets are going to change. It is widespread change.
That's very interesting, because there is a lot of conversation about, do we need to go backwards to go forwards? But maybe taking that point, Sarah, that Robin's mentioned, there are a lot of things we can learn from our past that maybe we should go back to. But it's interesting, you refers just to the simple thing of door handles. Obviously, technology is also facilitating that. There are footpads and there are remote controls to enable that as well. What is your thinking about the design of the future, not only to make it functional, but also to make people feel safe as well as be safe?
Well, as you mentioned, throughout the history, cities and buildings have been shaped by response to shocks and diseases in particular. For example, from the Romans' introduction of sewage systems through the cholera's influence in the 19th century on the modern street grid, I think this epidemic will play a part in city design for the future. The pandemic has forced the adoption of new ways of operation. For the office space, for example, organizations must reimagine their work and the role of offices in creating safe environment for the employees. But I think changing attitudes on the role of the office itself is essential. So before the pandemic, the conventional wisdom had been that office space were critical to productivity. That's why companies competed intensely for prime office space in major urban centers around the world. And many focused on solutions that were seen to promote collaboration, for example, densification, open space design, and others. However, during the pandemic, many people have been surprised by how quickly and effectively technologies like video conferencing, other forms of digital collaboration were adopted. For many, the results have been better than imagined. But at the same time, one thinks that has working from home succeeded to this level only because it was viewed as temporary and not permanent. I think both sides of the argument are probably right. Many forms of virtual collaboration are working well. For some people, maybe for others, not especially. For example, if you just started at the firm or you're a fresh graduate and you need the direct interaction with your colleagues. As Robin said, I think there is no one and only solution. The answer is probably different for every organization, sector, what talents will be needed, what role is important, what is the level of collaboration needed. But I think among all of what was mentioned, this points toward one major outcome, and it will be a goal in the future, and I think it's flexibility and adaptability. For example, in the Office of the Future, technology will play a central role in enabling employees to return to office buildings to work safely, or they can collaborate remotely through, for example, virtual whiteboards instead of being physically in the office. And I think new working models will quickly shift from being only futuristic ideas that usually young people like to use to a standard practice. In terms of space, I think a transformational approach to reinvent offices and resizing the footprint creatively will be necessary. And here I don't mean only adjusting or adding few partitions and social distancing measures to the office, but companies should take a fresh look at how much and where space is required. That kind of approach questions as well the location of the office. So some companies after the pandemic will continue to have them in big cities, while others will prefer to save some money as they were working good remotely and just, maybe head to suburbs or decrease the footprint of their office.
Yeah, it's interesting to try and link that back, Hedley. You mentioned about the erosion of profits within the industry, but at the end of the day, you've got to earn those profits.
Yes.
Where do you see examples of people addressing the sorts of issues that both Robin and Sarah have referred to maybe get back to a point where margins are sustainable and appropriate, but earned?
Yes. Well, again, rather like Robin and Sarah have said, there isn't one single solution to this. There are a number of different directions that it could be approached. One is the introduction of technologies, and we need to be careful in looking at that, because there tends to be in construction there tends to be an effort to graft it onto existing systems rather than re-engineer the systems to fit the technology, so you make the most use of the technology. Aviation's very good at this. It really looks at the systems to accommodate the technology and people in a safe way and looking after people's well-being. We've seen processes of grafting in BIM, grafting in other technologies directly for safety issues. So that's one area of change. Another area of change could be less emphasis just on bidding, where we know that the outturn prices often bear very little relationship to the bid price. So we probably have an overemphasis on that, but that needs working with clients over a long period of time, especially repeat clients, to shift that. And another which has been mentioned are the sort of mindsets and attitudes that we have towards working, and being prepared to invest in the sorts of systems and processes that may help us to shift things in the future. Now the balance here, Brendan, is getting the right mix of making investments without threatening the profitability in the short run. And that's the problem. In order to transition to a more profitable industry in 15, 20 years' time, there is a period of pain, if you like, where the very lean companies that are almost anorexic won't be able to do it. But those that have got a bit of room for manoeuvre will, and they can. But the choice is theirs, of course.
Yes, of course. Just to remind those people that have just joined us, you're very welcome. Use the chat facility to raise any questions. Lovely to see some of you on screen. If at all possible, if you could turn your cameras off, it might just help the general the bandwidth that we're all dealing with, but I'll leave that up to you. I can't insist upon it. Robin, I was struck by one of the points you made there with the inserts into the ducts. One of the things I'm particularly conscious of in the last 12 months is we are putting so much trust in epidemiology, the health sector and the like. So there is talk about vaccinations that people want. At the start of this, it took 3 to 5 years to get it through. It's been rolled out so quickly, and yet we have very quickly trusted that it is safe to put into our bodies. In a similar way, I get the impression that society in general don't trust us as a sector to do what's right for them and look after them. What, in your view, do we need to do as a sector to make sure that we can come up with the right solutions, both from a design perspective and an implementation perspective, that A, works, is functional, is aesthetically viable, but it creates that safe environment that we will all need to have? Where is the trust issue in that?
It's a fascinating subject. As far as organisations are concerned, we've already, in a pre-COVID world, we've seen some changes starting to take effect. We've seen a shift away from a corporate specification for buildings. I'll give you a typical example. If you go into the City of London, the sort of the banking face of a building, which is corporate, not particularly welcoming, it sets a very formal tone. Towards a world now where the people who are occupying buildings are starting to have a much stronger lead on how they are specified, the environment that they want to be a part of. And their employers are listening, simply because employee retention is now such a major issue. You spend so much money training people, building and developing their careers. And if you're not careful, they just walk out of the door. People forget that every evening, all of their assets, well, most of their assets, in particular in architecture, have 2 legs and go home at night. And you've got to attract them back into that working environment. It was interesting, just on Headley's particular point as well, that we have had a habit of cumulative specification creep, where we specify our buildings, and then the next generation of buildings come through and enhance that specification, and the next generation beyond that further enhance that specification. And we're now in a world where we have, in my view, buildings which are way over specified in many respects. And I think in terms of the occupants and that trust, if you could then just pull back, I mean, to mention the Victorians, they were quite clever, actually. If we go back to the Victorian equivalent of a warehouse, that's the opposite. That is just a mechanism that keeps the environment out and looks after what's inside, protects its assets. As a built form. We can learn a lot of lessons from that. So if you've got an occupier, why do we over specify the office space to try and attract them? Why don't we give them the office space that they want and need, and allow them, if they need to enhance the specification, to do that? And so that might then inform the way that we design buildings going in the future, where they are much simpler, much more economic to build, and much more adaptable to suit the occupier's need, rather than trying to be, the magic bullet in that respect, to serve everything. Yeah.
But as I think you said, and Sarah, maybe you could come in here, the building itself is really important. But as you said, it's invariably populated by people on 2 legs who come and go. And buildings themselves only exist if they're part of the whole community. Mm-hmm. So what do you think is the future, Sarah, about not only the design of buildings, but the placemaking and the infrastructure that supports the to and from buildings, so that it all becomes cohesive, rather than there's a good bit and a bad bit, and you have to suffer the bad bit to enjoy the good bit, and vice versa?
Expanding on the over-specifying the building use, the case of refurbishment has never been stronger. I think not just because it is a low carbon alternative, it's also cost effective and has the benefit of faster speed to market delivery, as well as being an opportunity to unlock assets in high demand locations, especially in the center, for example, when it will recover. From a work point of view, the short-term use for the office will have to adapt for the new needs. Offices will be refurbished to be a safer and flexible environment with layouts modified. But I think the broad view can be better explained from a social point of view. As people have replaced in-person visits to sports, for example, entertainment venues, retail centers, by virtual gatherings and Zoom meetings, we can conclude that virtual is not only the long-term solution for authentic human interaction, especially after the pandemic. In fact, I believe that the current crisis is only reinforcing the vital role that public places play in bringing people together. That's why, in my opinion, mixed use will be developed rapidly after the pandemic, and the repurposing of existing space will not only cater the safety needs, but the actual building use and specification that Robin was talking about by itself. I think the questions will be how to integrate services within the abandoned or the excess of office spaces, what services those can be, what has to change for mixed-use developments to be both safe and vibrant, and what will the mixed-use and public places feel like after the pandemic from a user perspective.
So, Hedley, this is all eminently desirable, all eminently achievable, but do we have the structure in the sector already to deliver that, or does there need to be a fundamental change, in your opinion?
I think we've got some of the structures, maybe not all of them. I think for the main contractors, the main piece that is missing is weak program management currently. At the moment, we look at projects by their facility type or building type or the sector they're in, and then we look at each individual project. But between that global or large scale and the micro level of the project, I think some program management could really help. We tend to follow clients' programs rather than manage our own bundle of projects. A good example of this would be knowledge management, which is still weakly developed in contractors, relying too much on IT systems with low levels of engagement. And if you're going to roll out knowledge transfer across your programs, it's very across your projects, you need good program management to affect that. The same goes for health and safety. And it's interesting that if we put those two things together, knowledge management and transfer is generally seen as a technical issue, whereas health and safety, which has good information systems but poor knowledge transfer, doesn't link with knowledge management. So program management could help to bring those together, for example.
Interesting. Okay, thank you. But I could just remind everyone to use the chat box if you want to raise any queries, questions for later, or you want to comment on anything that's been said so far. Robin, you mentioned that you believe a lot of the current building stock is overspecified, and Sarah was referring to the repurposing of buildings. Do you see that as being compatible, or does the overspecification create its own problems that we need to almost start again?
Several answers to that one. I don't think we need to start again. We can't start again. We have too much invested in our current stock. So it's how adaptable is that current stock? And you can see, I mean, current trends which have been going for many years now, where you know, I think that the death of an office building has been over-reported recently. But equally, the specification for false ceilings is also somewhat jaded in that now we're not putting ceilings in. They were thought to be an essential. The BCO grade A office space said thou shalt have 2.75 clear, and what it meant was clear from a raised floor to the underside of a false ceiling. So already the buildings that we have are having some of those fit out items stripped out of them, because they're now deemed unnecessary. And the benefit of that extra ceiling height in terms of the enjoyment of space, that lack of compression, that enjoyment takes you, I guess, a little bit more towards the old Victorian warehouses, which did have residual load bearing capacity in the frame and did have very generous fall to ceiling heights. And if I was refurbishing any building, I would give me one of those any day, because I know I can just about do anything with it. I can knock holes in it. I can introduce staircases. You know, they are probably some of the most flexible structures that we could work with. And please don't misunderstand architecture. And I hope I'm speaking for the profession as a whole. I mean, working on a greenfield site with a brand new building is quite a challenge. You know, to come up with an innovative idea that's something special. Working with an existing building, you can be so creative and turn those into wonderful contemporary places for people to work. But they add a second dimension, which is I was talking about buildings needing to be attractive as a place to work. We have to cater for those who are using our buildings rather than, if you like, the people commissioning them now. It's far more important. And as part of that, older buildings tend to have character. And that character is a very difficult thing to capture the essence of in a new building. That chemistry, that sort of warm, cuddly feeling that they tend to generate. There are bad examples, I know, but there are some much loved assets that sit in the city of London, for example, in the centre of Birmingham, in all of our towns and cities. And so I think there's a fantastic opportunity, not just in terms of looking to the future for new build, but also, as Sarah said earlier, how can we make more of what we've already got? And it doesn't take much to start to address some of that low-hanging fruit, to make those buildings more amenable, more friendly for their occupants, and still exciting.
Just to remind those people that have joined, please do use the chat to add your Q&A, and if you can turn your cameras off, that would be appreciated. It just helps the bandwidth. But if you can't or you won't, it's lovely to see you on screen. Sarah, just building on that point, have you, and particularly you mentioned earlier the use of data, have you seen any particular areas of innovation or experimentation that you see a lot of value in the future and that you think is really leading the way?
I think the whole population has had a massive crash course in modern technology because of this pandemic. So I think these new skills and experiences will be the true engine of change. For instance, now that companies have been forced to try telecommuting, many will decide it's less expensive and more efficient to allow people to work from home. But there's actually a second and third order effects that we haven't considered. For example, increasing gender equity in the workforce, as parents are better to balance work and home life in that manner. Telecommuters might create smaller, cheaper, and revive the rural environments. So I think companies need to look at the pandemic as an opportunity to modernize how people work. And this should not only include shifting to working from home, but at the same time, employees must build resilience and actively preserve boundaries between home and their job, not only to boost performance, but to take care of their employees' well-being, which was a crucial factor while sitting for 1 year in front of your laptop. So I think from a more humane point of view, one way to help achieve this is to empower workers by giving them more autonomy in determining their working arrangement, maybe greater control over how and when to work. I think this will lead to great productivity and maybe reduce stress for the long term. In terms of what will change, I think the transformation in relation to infrastructure and the office will have a huge impact. And not only I'm talking about the travel infrastructure, but I think our whole lifestyle might change with priorities shifting and sustainable approaches now recognized more than ever. So maybe a restructuring of society might seem frightening at this point, but it can provide the opportunity for radical new social arrangements that are now not only more efficient, but also more humane. This is, I think, the more important innovation that we should keep on after the pandemic.
It's interesting, Hedley, isn't it, that there is a lot more talk, certainly in my experience in the sector, about the softer sides of how we deliver construction. But also, taking Robin's point about the over-specification and the stock that we already have, and Sarah has been saying about how we need to repurpose it, your reference earlier to knowledge management.
Yeah.
There are organisations that are now getting extremely smart at surveying the existing asset that will enable that repurposing and to inform future developments. Are you seeing anything really smart, either in the UK, Ireland, or further afield, that is really enabling that, both from a technological point of view, but also from a business model perspective?
From a technical point of view, I'm probably not the ideal person to respond to, and others may know more about that than I do. But in terms of the business model, we're seeing changes with from the States, with the different types of players coming in that are using digital platforms really for parts of the construction process, not for the whole of it. And the growth is even greater and more sophisticated in China regarding that too. And I think that is going to shift things a bit and will internationally, and then it will accelerate more and more. And it's a question of whether the main contractors respond to that or not. In terms of repurposing existing buildings, some of those digital processes are not so appropriate for. It's easier when you're dealing with a blank sheet of paper than it is reconfiguring something that already exists. And that may prove to be a very important market for a lot of contractors in the longer run, and an area where they can really invest in and protect that market, I think, in terms of the business model.
Okay. Well, look, I think we'll start moving towards the Q&A. There's obviously some interesting thoughts that have been raised already that maybe we could build on. I think picking up on that softer side, Luke was asking that question about in-person meetings might not be needed. In-person meetings might not be needed for productivity, but has creativity suffered? He personally, I'm sure many of us share his view that missed the spark of riffing on ideas and those water cooler moments. How is that going to change the whole dynamic of our sector? Because, you know, in many ways, I think we've proven to be an essential service. We are one of those sectors that has needed to and has kept on performing throughout this. So how are we going to get the balance right? Who wants to lead off with a response to that?
I'm happy to take a start. I think it's going to change the way that our buildings present themselves to the outside world. I think the idea of walking into the bank building and disappearing up onto an anonymous floor as a building occupier and as a guest, I think those days are numbered. I think we're going to be very much more sensitive to the way that we use our environment. I mentioned points of compression like lifts and trains and taxis and things, which make people think very carefully about who was in that lift before me. I don't think that's going to go away. I think when you've been in lockdown for the length of time we have, you are now for a generation more acutely sensitive to that. So we do need lifts to move through buildings, but we don't need to let the great unwashed into our buildings. You know, how you receive visitors and guests, I think, will change the way that we need space, the way we use space, and the way we configure our buildings. The ground floor, I think, needs to become certainly more extrovert. We've already seen changes like cafes and restaurants, and cafes in particular, and coffee shops. The boundary between that and the reception lobby softening and almost disappearing, and in fact disappearing in many cases. But, you know, the idea of having shared space at the lower parts of any building, residential as well as office buildings, where you go for particular tasks, you go for meetings, is a way of now starting to segregate the way that we conduct our lives. You keep your work environment perhaps more for work related, where it's safer. We introduce more interconnecting stairs in buildings so that we don't have to go into points of compression like a lift, that they are more free flowing and less congested. But I think it's also going to affect how we get to our buildings and our streetscapes. I mean, in London, I'm in the office today, and I've come in on a bicycle, and I've noticed just how many of London's roads have sneakily introduced cycleways. They're out there doing the roadworks whilst the traffic levels are relatively low. I think there are some fantastic opportunities to sneak in many more things, a better public realm, a better way of using space. Some of the pedestrianisation efforts, or rather shared surface efforts, for example, in and around Marylebone High Street, have been particularly successful at adding value, at creating front doors and addresses in what were otherwise backstreet service streets, which are now driving significant value for the owners of those buildings that they never thought was possible. So it's again multifaceted. It's not just a building related thing. I think it's a whole environment, and I could go on and start to talk about the places that we live in, but I'll leave it there.
Yeah. Well,
Brendan, just let me expand on the issue about creativity, if it will still grow without an in-person contact. I mean, I think that's why there's no one and only solution. I think this will depend on the organizations in terms of the services that they provide. And I don't think there's one sustainable solution that will last for a long term. That's why we should have this flexibility and adaptability to choose different modes of working and place of working through at different times after the pandemic.
It's interesting because maybe picking up on a couple of the questions Mike and Fergus have raised really interesting points about the creation of more effective remote working spaces, but also about the effectiveness of infrastructure to get you to and from. I know I've been having a number of discussions with people over in Ireland. There's big question marks about the transport infrastructure anyway, and I think it is prompting a review of the national planning framework. But people have genuinely enjoy the ability to work remotely in a very pleasant environment, but desperately miss, as Luke mentioned earlier, that interaction, that social interaction, but don't want to compromise again on having to get involved in really difficult commutes. So what would be an ideal future scenario that picks up that remote working, picks up that vibrancy of a city centre type environment, but also having an effective infrastructure that facilitates that? What would be your vision for that, Sarah?
I think the pandemic will definitely affect densities in cities. It won't have only an impact on indoor environments, but it might reshape the city. Actually, an extreme few fear the risk that the crisis could revive the Euclidean zoning and the suburban model of a single-family house supported by private cars, because everyone is enjoying working from home. And I think this will stimulate urban sprawl and diminish cities' greatest strength, I mean, their density. But in response, I think some architects are rethinking urban infrastructure to promote a more local lifestyle where distance communication could bring major change to cities and suburbs. This will create some form of neighborhoods and promote decentralization, where you can have this resilience in your local neighborhood. You can do those kind of interaction and activities, and at the same time, you'll be able to produce and work and maintain this healthy social lifestyle. So this decentralization approach might be a solution for the future.
I mean, it's interesting, some of the problems that working from home creates. I mean, London is not an affordable place to live, unfortunately. And working from home simply compounds the problem for those who can least afford it. And so the idea that you somehow in your one-bedroom apartment eke out a place where you can comfortably work for a long period of time, that's a tough challenge. And I don't think we're going to be able to change that. The one thing you can do is to repurpose, for example, the ground floor of many of those buildings. And if you can introduce a co-working space, I mean, we are pack animals. We need contact. We need, as Luke has said, you need that sort of riffing opportunity to bounce ideas off each other, not within the same profession, in fact, more ideally with people you've never met before. And so those social opportunities happen potentially at the base of all buildings, not just offices, but residential buildings as well. And so within cities, I think there's so much that we can do now to help to encourage the home working to a degree. But I don't think it will ever replace that need to be in part of an office environment for most of our commercial needs.
And I'm very conscious that the buildings are just part of this. Going back to Fergus's question, it's about the whole infrastructure. Do we have too much, not enough? Or is it just in the wrong places or doing the wrong things? Anyone?
I think we've got very good infrastructure. We are incredibly lucky. It varies around the UK, I have to say, and there are some. There are many who have and have not.
Yeah.
But I think we need to look at repurposing our infrastructure. I don't think this worry and concern about being in close proximity to other people is going to go away quickly, and we need to get back that confidence in using public transport, and that is a massive challenge. I mean, the idea of going back into a packed tube train, I can't see that happening for any time soon, and they are extremely expensive pieces of investment by government, and so we have to find a way of making better use of them.
There's a very interesting question from Stella. She's looking for a bit of free advice, please. She's planning a one-off new building for a charity client with limited funds. Where do we look for the clever thinking that will find simple ways to make the building operate safely so that users will feel confident in using it? So I think there's a really important point there. We all want that, but I think there is a particular financial driver that says, how can you achieve that at not the cheapest possible cost, but the optimum cost? It's a real challenge for us, isn't it? Because we can have these grand ideas, grand visions, but it's got to be affordable and we've got to deliver the return that Headley was referring to earlier. So
why not just keep it simple? Keep it simple. You know, we have a horrible habit of overcomplicating everything we touch, and buildings could go back to being very simple points of shelter. And if you need a complex one, add the complexity, but only as much as you need.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yes, and I think the other thing is we because of the cost drivers, and particularly from bidding, we tend to focus more on the time, cost, quality rather than the outcomes. And I think as an industry we're pretty poor, not just contractors, architects, engineers, all the consultancies, in understanding how people actually use buildings, whether it's in terms of productivity for the user or whether it's in terms of meeting social policy. We could collect more data on that. We've been better at whole life costs, still a long way to go, but the actual way in which buildings are used, and sometimes that is very simple buildings that are flexible, can be very helpful. And we need to know more about that so that we can produce buildings for today and tomorrow.
Yeah. I mean, just to be a slight, I think I understand your comment about being poor. I've got to say that I've been heartened by the sorts of conversations that we do have now. There are so many people that do recognise the outcome base. It's just I do take your point, however, we've got to make that the norm and more generalised than it currently is. Totally agree with that. Any thoughts, Sarah? Have we lost you, Sarah? Maybe we've lost you. But look, there's interesting comments coming in. You've sparked a bit of thought, Headley, on the business model and the whole profit issue. So David has said, I was interested in the declining profit margin comments. What can the construction industry do to stop the practice of lowball quotes, as it invariably ends up resulting in insolvency for the contractor and destruction for all involved in the contract? I know we've sort of discussed that, but do you want to just maybe give a concise response to that?
It's a long-term issue. It's not going to change quickly. It's a re-education process within contractors, with clients, and with shareholders. Those are the three key stakeholders, but also the clients in terms of the costs that they may incur as well on occasions. So the family-owned businesses are much better placed than those that are publicly quoted, because they have short-term horizons, which are not helping. But there needs to be an education process there. Contractors are the first to say clients should go for value, but in a downturn, they're the worst at educating clients to go for the lowest price in order to survive. And that somehow has got to change. That attitude has to shift in some way, and the contractors can't do it on their own. They're going to have to work closely with clients as a re-education process, and with shareholders as a re-education process to shift the ground.
You were nodding vehemently there, Robin. Was something you want to add?
It's fascinating, the comment about family-owned businesses versus the big corporates, which almost goes in the exact opposite direction of the idea of decentralizing and working from home. Because the thing that makes, I guess, the family businesses more successful is that sense of personal ownership. It can be quite easy when you're in a large corporate to be somewhat removed and remote from that sense of ownership of a client, of a project, of a package. And if you can encourage that sense of ownership, that sense of belonging, and therefore responsibility to the client, and by the way, from the client backwards as well, it's a two-way thing. Then I think the idea that you build trust and avoid those potential problems of underbidding on projects, because you are responsible for your client, for the successful delivery of a project for your client. But the client isn't stupid. You know, they don't want to knowingly go with an underbidding contractor or consultant, for that matter, because if that project goes bust on them, I mean, that is a massive headache for them. So again, it's a two-way process. We are pack animals. Trust is an incredibly important part of that.
Yeah, totally agree.
I think if I could add to that, over the last generation, contractors have spent a lot of time recognise the importance of relationships, particularly with work getting early on. Only 20% of work was repeat business in the early 80s. It's now about 60%. So that shifted through relationship building a lot. It's then developed through partnering contracts, and now with collaboration emphasised. One of the main problems is it's not systematic. It's left to individuals. Management say we must collaborate, we need to build trust, but it's left to individuals rather than systematically managed. And I think there's scope for improvement here, and that will help working with other parties too to address the profit margin issue.
Well, look, I need to draw this to a close. We could obviously talk forever on this subject, but maybe if I could just finish with a question prompted by Andrew there, and it's very much linked with what we've just been talking about. Andrew, I think, has probably read your paper as well, Headley, but I think we all agree on the dysfunctionality of the past, recognising there have been some great things, recognising the fact that you've got to earn, both as individuals and as corporates, you've got to earn the margin that you get. But I suppose the question really is about bearing in mind what has now happened. What is it that we, the collective industry, actually need to do about it to actually start to capitalise on all of the learning, all the experience that we've got to create something better for the future? Maybe you could just each of you give your brief thoughts just in conclusion, please. Robin, would you want to kick off on that, please?
Yep, I would. I think collaboration has an awful lot to say for it. The industry that we're in is the best team sport on the planet, and I'm sorry I'm not prepared to listen about rugby or football. Anything that we can do to encourage that communication between ourselves, our consultants and our clients and the users of buildings has got to be the best way of moving forward.
Thank you. Headley?
I completely echo that. I totally agree, and we often forget, don't we, that we're all on the same side rather than the too often reality of fighting against each other.
And you know, I'll ask you, Sarah, in a minute. But Headley, in your view, Andrew has suggested that we have the collective knowledge within the industry. Do you agree, or do you believe we? I think
technically we have, and I think in principle we have in terms of management, but I think we could improve further the way in which we manage the firms in the process. And I say the firms in the process because there's been too much emphasis on the operations without realising how much the management of firms supports the improvement of the operations, and that's often neglected.
Yeah, really important point. Yeah. And Sarah?
I think in addition to collaboration, learning from the most pressing need in construction, that was the speed, because quick creation of emergency facilities, for example, quarantine center, testing sites, temporary lodgings for front workers, demanded an overwhelming response. Much of it, for example, employing new techniques such as modular construction, integration of digitalization in the operations to increase efficiency. So here is like an optimistic view. Where the crisis is undoubtedly a challenge for the sector, it can represent an opportunity to accelerate the change. As we all know, the built environment is slow to adapt to new concepts for a variety of reasons. But in this pandemic, the necessity for immediate action led to a paradigm shift. And I think this shift can be used in the future as a model or a catalyst to increase the pace of change for the industry.
Excellent. Well, that's a bright way to finish it. Well, look, I will bring this to a conclusion. Thank you for your comments. There are a couple of questions that people may feel haven't been adequately responded to, or a couple that are still outstanding. We'll have a look at how we do respond to them in the future. And I'd like to thank you, Robin, for joining us this morning. Thank you also, Sarah. Particularly thank you, Headley, for coming in at that last minute. Really appreciate that. I'm sure others will have enjoyed your contribution. So thank you very much for that. As I said earlier, there will be a link to the recording that will be sent out to everyone that has registered to this. So look forward to that. There will be a few cameo appearances by people that have been popping on and off the camera, so that might add a bit of amusement to it. I would just like to conclude by saying that clearly COVID has had a dramatic effect on this. I don't think any of us will forget the fact that it's had a tragic impact on people's lives and businesses, and we should never forget that. But I think has been alluded to already, this also does create an opportunity. It's an opportunity for us all, and I truly believe it will be a catalyst for change in our sector. I've been particularly pleased with some of the conversations I've had, particularly in the last few months, where frankly they've been truly inspiring, where people have ideas, have initiatives, have drive to actually positively transform this sector. So I would really encourage people to keep the conversation going. If you do have ideas, please share them around the people who have joined us here today. If you've got ideas that you're struggling to develop or to take to the next stage, please contact us. We're always open to having those sorts of discussions to develop our collective thinking. But equally, if you do feel that you would like to contribute to future webinars or a podcast, we'd be very pleased to hear from you. But what I would say is, let's continue the conversation, but let's make sure the conversation is followed with action. So thank you everyone for joining us. Goodbye and keep safe.